coexistence of like depravity and piety is something that seems like very critical to understanding Gilles de Rais and the way that the things that he ended up doing. Not to say that they sort of flowed out of his religiosity, but I know you linked that one paper. What was it? Called "Sympathy for the Devil." It was like Gilles de Rais and his defenders or something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting meta paper that kind of talks about, exactly, like what his defenders do and but also how people who aren't even necessarily defending him can sometimes exonerate him by kind of making him, like, his acts like a symptom of society, or making him kind of a symbol of some kind of other thing or something like that. I don't know, like, if that type of thing is, like, kind of part and parcel of, like, talking about, like, doing things like in a historical materialist way. Like, that's kind of, like, but, it still is an interesting, thing to sort of review, sort of an interesting meta-analysis that he did, And I think he did have
Ben
Parsons.
Parsons. Yeah. He had some interesting like quotes of Bataille. I'm not sure if he goes to later like kind of critique these and like undermine them, but he talks about like how Bataille addresses the coexistence of piety and sacrilege in the career of his subject. Indeed, even when Gilles dedicated himself entirely to devil worship in the pursuit of, quote, power and wealth, he still believed he could, quote, prove himself an honest Christian and true Catholic. The last Easter before his arrest, for instance, he made a show of humility at the Church of Saint Trinité in Machecoul, giving confession in the same place as parishioners of low status, and in their company receiving the Eucharist. He also kept in his household a chapel of choristers, which he would carry with him on his journeys, and which he furnished with a great quantity of clothing in gold and silk, candlesticks, censers, crosses, dishes. As Michelet acidly comments, the poor wretch believed he had taken in God and devil at the same time. But for Bataille, such behavior reveals a greater truth about the late medieval Christianity itself. He reasons that if Gilles could carry out child murder and black magic without ceasing to be a good Catholic, then his conduct must already be implicit within his Catholicism. He writes, "This bedlam is not contrary to the truest Christianity, which is always ready to forgive crime. Perhaps Christianity is even fundamentally the pressing demand for crime, the demand for the horror that in a sense it needs in order to forgive." Bataille's point here is that Gilles' offenses are an outgrowth of the core values of medieval Christianity. This culture actively required scandalous evil in order to sustain its own practices, the rituals of penitence and absolution, and Gilles answered this need. For Bataille, the Christianity of the Middle Ages effectively conjured Gilles de Rais, in much the same way that the man himself, quote, made invocations or conjurations of evil spirits. So that's definitely interesting. I mean, Bataille's analysis of that is interesting. At the same time, I don't know. I do feel a little bit of reticence toward the idea of that basically it directly stems out an outgrowth of the core values of medieval Christianity.
Yeah, and I also think that's the thing. Like, we have people who kind of do very similar things now. And we also so I think that, again, it's this requires some kind of psychoanalytic, sort of unconscious aspect to it, because certainly it's an interesting thing, but we can go into later, which is sort of the way that Gilles de Rais' repentance at his trial was received, and his sort of almost sanctification after his death, which is an interesting wrinkle or an interesting component to this that I think, maybe some of those arguments are based on. Georges Bataille, by the way, is the, biggest modern kind of de Rais biographer, or one of the, big Paramount long form writers on de Rais. But so I think that, again, I am kind of two minds about it, where I think it's a tricky situation, because I think that Bataille definitely goes too far in more than a few places with it. on the other hand, like, there obviously, like, people are, like, we live in a society, so, like, the way that these things express themselves are, like, a function in some way of society, but I think that he's going a bit further. And, yeah, Parsons also calls out another essay that I read that I found to have a lot of interesting parts, but also to do something similar, which is what I mentioned before. It's Confessions of a Medieval Sodomite in an edited volume called Perversion and the Social Relation by James Penny. And his essay really is like an extended critique of Bataille. It's all about how, a critique of Bataille. It's about how he, sort of basically sees Gilles de Rais as, sort of he basically has a reverse of what James Penny thinks it should be in this dynamic. Like, Bataille feels that the audience, came to sort of... Well, I guess maybe the best way to approach it is to sort of frame how this happened. So, one thing that has intrigued a lot of historians about the trial is that during the trial, when Gilles de Rais sort of confessed what he did in such extreme terms... and admitted to what he did, so clearly and in such sort of extreme detail, then the audience actually, this kind of won some sympathy for the judges, and also especially from the assembled crowd, including some of the people whose families were victimized by him, were then kind of praying for his forgiveness. And, the... Bataille's argument kind of is that they sort of knew that they were complicit in, what he had done in some way. And that as a result of that, kind of like in line with what you had read from the other thing, and that they were sort of, praying for him because they were feeling their sort of complicity with him. Whereas Penny takes another tact, which is to say that they wanted to believe that they weren't guilty, but were in fact innocent, and their association with his guilt was actually unconscious, and so that they prayed for him, and they, came to see him as in some way holy, because through his, confession of these extremely unholy and demonic things, because they, maybe unconsciously had a sense of their guilt, but consciously were wanting their innocence. I'll try to read
the idea behind that is basically that, if we can forgive this wealthy, famous elite that did the absolute worst things imaginable, then all of us are worthy of, or candidates for salvation for all the horrible things we've done, kind of thing on a subconscious level.
Right, they basically have the same idea, but it's kind of different, like, in terms of their analysis of it. This is what Penny says about it. It becomes necessary to inquire after the type of object Gilles constituted for his confession's auditors. Bataille, for his part, attributes Gilles' apparent seduction of the crowd to a strange power of persuasion traceable, but not perfectly reducible, to the impressiveness of his feudal authority. Of what metaphysical attributes does this charismatic supplement consist? Bataille explains the compassion of the audience for Gilles de Rais by claiming that its members were able, during the trial, to realize through their tears that this great lord who was to die, being the most notorious of criminals, was like everyone in the crowd. But Penny has an alternative reading, which is that he had this attribute of transferential fascination for the crowd, not through his admissions of guilt, but rather through his protestations of innocence. What is so moving about Gilles is not the manner in which he presents an externalization of the public's guilty regret at having in some manner contributed, however unwittingly, to the children's grisly end. Instead, Gilles' strange charisma should be explained with reference to the means he provides to his audience to exercise these intuitions, to eradicate them through the unfurling of a beautiful image of divinely sanctioned purity. Gilles' furnishing to the audience of a means of escape from a messy interrogation of its own complicity in the demise of the children explains the apparent lack of any dissenting voices in the trial. Gilles is able to confess in such morbid detail precisely because he premises his testimony on an unshakable conviction in a properly metaphysical innocence, an innocence that remains pristinely independent of anything of the order of empirical reality, and that paradoxically increases, in consequence, in direct proportion to the, quote, objective guilt Gilles accrues through the confessional narration of his crimes. From a historical perspective, one could even go so far as to say the decline of the rigid feudal social structure is a factor in this process. This is one of the more interesting parts of the essay to me. Insofar as the phenomenon of the emerging capitalist mode of production displaces the subject's critical agency from the external figure of the feudal superior, lord, guildmaster, etc., to a, quote, internal critical voice of the bourgeois moderation and frugality. It might be said that a general cultural anxiety related to the subjectification or individuation of the moral voice in part contributed to the audience's inability to fashion a more autonomous, quote, responsible relation to Gilles' confession. In this view, at the historical moment of the trial, the feudal masses, subject to increasing urbanization and greater independence with respect to the landed lords, were confronted with the anxious hysteria to which their very relative freedom gave rise. Subject to the new abstract and unpredictable laws of commercial exchange that for us have long since become overfamiliar, the subject of Nantes came to recognize that the trial of Gilles de Rais presented the prospect of creating a kind of cult premised on both a covert nostalgia for the old, however oppressive, social certainties, and the dissimulation of a traumatic yet irresistible enjoyment. So that's all very Lacanian, and I don't fully agree with all of it, but that's like, you know, and that is critiqued by Parsons as itself having some of the same problems as what Bataille has, and sort of scapegoating, the society for, what de Rais did. But,
and kind of getting away from, I don't know, the material significance of, like, did he satanically sacrifice 150 children?
This guy, for his part, does say, like, very clearly that he does think that he was guilty. But, by seeking God's forgiveness so fervently and confessing so, extensively to what he did, and trying to avoid excommunication, he was able kind of to turn it around and achieve really, and it is like a interesting, like a conspicuous historical fact that, compared to his comrade at arms, Joan of Arc, he did become more saintly, like, more quickly after he died. Like, just 9 years after his death, I think, or shortly after his death, like an ancestor, a descendant of his, like a niece or something, erected sort of exculpatory monument near his grave in Nantes, which is another thing, because, he wasn't, because of the way he confessed and he begged for reconciliation to the church, he wasn't fully burned. He was just singed and then rescued from the fire, and he was buried in holy ground, in the church. Because, he confessed, whereas Joan of Arc didn't really go so far in doing that. She didn't, like, really, she kind of did, but she was like, no, I was afraid of the fire. She kind of waffled a little bit on admitting to being what a heretic as she was accused of being. Whereas Gilles de Rais went all in and was like, yes, I'm a horrible Satanist, I'm a child murderer, I did all this stuff, like
basically,
blah, blah,
like, please execute me, me. Like that kind of thing, which weirdly, led to kind of like this kind of controlled rehabilitation of him after he died, and he became a symbol of, you're right, because there were a lot of I think we can circle back around to that in a little bit, of like actual changes in like the productive forces and the power structures going on at that time that kind of put the old feudalist kind of structure that he had achieved so much glory within that system, kind of made it, this outdated thing or something that would have to evolve, and he became like a convenient scapegoat perhaps for all the other lords and the clergy and everybody else to kind of almost like sacrifice in a weird way to like it is almost like in a Christian way, like it's like he died for everyone else's sins. He died for the sins of the old feudal aristocracy so that they could like have eternal life and still be a part of like the French power system, but also like they're going to have to embrace like new values, and it's not just on this like swaggering chivalry and getting visions from the Archangel Michael, etc.
For access to the full-length episode, subscribe to the Hour of Frequency at patreon.com/subliminaljihad.